So, we haven't done card breakdowns for Omens of the Past yet, and it's a little past time. I was hoping to do it like a couple of weeks in after I'd gotten a basic vision of the cards, but we just kind of didn't have the time then to sort of fix things up. There were a couple of things that I needed to do first, so we're gonna start on them now. There's a bunch of new cards. I'm gonna do the fire cards first, and then I might do praxis after if we've got the time. Because yeah, or I might do the next color too. There's a lot of different ways to do this. But yeah, what we have are the fire cards from Omens of the Past all lined up in front of me. I can do it just so that I can preview them nice and big in the current setup that I've got. So that looks like it's gonna work pretty well for me. So first card on the list out of the Omens packs is Main Cub, which is a card that I like quite a bit, actually. It's a little 1/1 that says deal 1 damage to an enemy unit. That is not unit or player, which is an important thing to note about it. But in general, this card is significantly better than its counterpart, the Forge Wolf, and significantly cuter. I'm a big fan of this card as a little draft uncommon. I think that mild removal is very important, and also Main Cub in draft is just there's so many things at one that are really, really worth killing. Amongst them, many of the best flyers, there are some 3-drop flyers that are 3/1s, namely the Spark Flyer and Sky Snapper. There are a lot of little units that have 1 health that are pretty nasty to deal with, like Amethyst Acolyte. There's a lot of just 1-drops that pick up some sort of thing that need to be swept off the board so you can swing in with your 2-drops. Basically, Main Cub is going to get rid of all of those cards, and it also can be added onto, because it deals damage, it can be added onto other damaging spells in Fire to make removal stick when it otherwise wouldn't be able to. That alone makes it just really worth picking up in draft. I think it's this very solid B to A card. This is just a good card to be putting down on turn 1 or on a prevailing turn later. It's something you're pretty happy to draw, and it's also something you're fairly okay with just playing early. Yeah, adorable little guy, and I think he does a pretty good job at what he does in draft. In ranked, he has a slight stat problem. So, that's something that you need to worry about. But he's got some potential. I'd say that he's not gonna be a card in most of your ranked decks, but if you need to have some early game aside from Oni Ronin, Main Cub is a decent competitor for that slot. So, it definitely wouldn't be a card that I'd slot in over Oni Ronin, but there aren't that many 1-drops in red at 1 that are, super worth it. Pyro Knight and Oni Ronin are the main ones. If you're keeping the curve even lower, Main Cub makes a decent third. So yeah, not a bad card at all. I would say that this is a really solid draft pickup, and in terms of ranked, I'm not sure if he's gonna see play, but he's certainly got some potential with that little bit of extra damage. Deal 1 damage is actually a much more powerful summon effect than you'd expect, and I think it's got some kick to it. Forge Wolf is in Omens. You can draw it out of Omens of the Past packs, and it's still pretty terrible. This card, in comparison to Main Cub, is significantly worse. I've said before about Forge Wolf that a lot of its job is to make other cards look good, but also, yeah, I think that, yeah, he just doesn't really do much as far as things go. Forge Wolf's main deal is that he can pop the Aegis on an Island's Favor or a Celestial Drake, and that is about the only good thing that he's ever going to do for your team. Because he doesn't affect the board state, and because just dealing 1 damage is not only not a good way to race people or generate consistent damage, but just basically this card has very, very low impact on the board. So you might as well not have played a card than to have played Forge Wolf, and typically you don't want this card in your deck. I would say it's not very good in draft, and it's not very good in ranked. So yeah, pretty bad card in general. Hidden Shiv, +1/+0 with Warp weapon. So this is the first of our Warp cards, which is a prevailing theme in red and yellow. Hidden Shiv is a pretty good example of how this type of card can be very, very good. Hidden Shiv functions very similar to Ornate Katana, the 2/0 weapon that gives you a little bit of bonus damage and also the potential for card draw, although Katana guarantees the card draw, whereas Hidden Shiv is most of the time you're gonna get the card draw. It's hard to evaluate Warp in terms of what type of card advantage it gives you. However, on cards like this, it's typically going to be like for every 4 hidden shivs that you have in your deck, you're going to get 3 of them for free, I would say, is sort of the idea. So, like, yeah, it's got reasonable amounts of card advantage attached to it. The weapon can trigger a lot of interesting things like Oni Quartermaster. In terms of draft, this card does buff up units that need to be above 3, which is really important for Rebel Sharpshooter and Bright Mace Paladin. It buffs up flyers, which is pretty good. Basically, there are a lot of units that can really do with 1 extra damage, and Hidden Shiv is pretty good at making that happen without actually breaking the bank on your deck's card advantage. Even if you're just playing it for 1, it's not the worst feeling in the world, especially if you're putting it on a very relevant unit. So I think Hidden Shiv has some playability in draft in particular. In Ranked, this card has potential for shenanigans. Like, you have the ability to play it with, of course, like cards like Oni Quartermaster, cards like anything that reduces the cost of cards. You can play it with a bunch of different warp cards to make your deck very fully warp and continue to just warp all of the stuff off your deck, which is something that you're trying to do with warp cards, and there's barely the amount of cards that you need for it. So Hidden Shiv fits into those slots decently well. I would not say it's like a super high-ranked card in Ranked, but it's definitely got some decks that you can put it in, and there are a lot of decks that you would be surprised to find that it fits in. Like, it is just reasonable as a weapon and pretty decently aggressive. I kind of think it might have a place in some Rakano decks. I haven't considered that, actually, but it's until just about now. But, like, the ability to Warcry a Hidden Shiv and then put it on top of your on top of a unit is reasonably strong. And you can also just, like, yeah, like, because weapons in Rakano are so, like, tricky, like anything that draws you a card and is also a weapon has some potential. Like, there might be a deck archetype around Warp and Ornate Katana and a bunch of Warcry units. I think that might be a thing that happens. In any case, like, Hidden Shiv, reasonably strong on both ends. It's not going to completely warp the board in either direction, but if you have the right type of rank deck, you might be able to abuse it in some interesting fashions. And of course, like, this card does behave fairly well in Skycrag type decks where you can actually put it on top of your deck, so that's something else to keep an eye on. I don't know if there's a lot of potential to break warp cards at the moment, but this is one of those ones that's actually pretty close to being breakable, so worth experimenting with, to be sure. On the Hunt. 1 cost, put a 4/4 Hellhound with charge on top of your deck. In draft and in ranked, I'd say this card has sort of proven itself to have, like, decent potential. It often punishes you in a way that you don't really see, and therefore you can lose games to On the Hunt without ever really knowing that you've lost games to On the Hunt, so that's a card that you really have to be wary of. But a 2-cost 4/4 on turn 2 is extremely good. A 2-cost 4/4 in a deck that is, like, mostly, like, low on threats in general, later in the game is, okay. I would say that this card is definitely pretty decent in hyper aggro. I'd say in draft that a 4/4 Hellhound with charge is a perfectly reasonable thing to play for 3, and like, even losing the card advantage might not be that bad if your deck is kind of aggressive. But you have to be wary of this card as it is something of a trap, and it is going to damage your card advantage in a pretty significant fashion. This is a pretty clear demonstration of, like, aggro matters. If you don't have the ability to deal the additional damage to push across and win the game very, very quickly, you never want to play On the Hunt. If your deck is super, super fast, then On the Hunt is actually a pretty solid addition to the deck, and that goes for draft or ranked. Pummel. Oh, we should actually be running the, like, premium versions of these out. So there's the premium On the Hunt. Here's the premium Pummel. Okay, Pummel. Give one of your attacking units +2/+2 this turn. Look at the top card of your deck and put it on the bottom. I'm very impressed with this card. It behaves very well in draft. It behaves very well in ranked. This is a decently core card in Skycrag aggro. I think it has a place in some Rakano aggro and Stonescar aggro decks as well, and possibly in some Praxis aggro, although I haven't really seen that much of that, and most of the Praxis aggro is more focused on tokens, which I think is, you know, fairly reasonable. There are 2 things that make Pummel unique from other tricks in terms of, like, what you're seeing in red. Like, this card sort of matches up against Overwhelm, and against Overwhelm it is just a better card, and you're typically going to want to run Pummel in pretty much every situation where you would want to run Rampage, which is what the Overwhelm card that I'm talking about is called. Yeah, so, like, there are a couple of reasons why you might want to run Rampage over Overwhelm, but it's specifically relating to you being able to get across, like, a Sansari Brigand or something crazy like that. Pummel fits very well into just any sort of fast aggressive deck. The +2/+2 means that the unit that you are pummeling almost always survives, which is very, very rare for red decks, and means that you get to actually keep a lot of things alive that would otherwise be unable to live. Pummel is really important because it can actually block torches, like 2/2 units that are attacking in like Rakano Outlaw really, really like having Pummel on them. There are a lot of 2 health units that are actually quite fond of Pummel, and this card's extra attack buff is also very useful on the aggression. The look at the top card of your deck, you may put it on the bottom. Scry effect is an extremely powerful effect that it very closely functions. It functions very similarly to draw a card in an aggro deck, and it might be, like, of the 5, one of the best of the cycle. Like, I think Extract is very close as well. Trailblaze and Excavation Assistant are a little below this, to be certain, and I can't actually remember what the last one is, but I'm sure that we'll get to it at some point. But yeah, like, as far as the cycle of different, like, scry cards, look at the top card, put it on the bottom, goes, this one's very, very good. It really, really helps out the aggressive deck because you get to do things like put lands on the bottom so that you don't ever draw them. A lot of aggro decks never want to draw more than 5 lands, so having access to Pummel really, really helps them out. And it also, like, does give that health bonus, which is really important, so you actually get to trade with the unit that you're supposed to be trading with. And yeah, I think this card is actually really, really flexible and does a lot of things for aggro that, like, makes aggro more flexible. So it's well worth running. It's super strong in Skycrag, and I think it definitely deserves some play in both draft and ranked. Young Gun doesn't impress me. As a 1/1 with Quick Draw, this card really, really likes weapons, and that includes things like Hidden Shiv and Katana. And if you're playing with Hidden Shiv and Katana, there might be a reason to play Young Gun, but you still might want to just play Pyro Knights or Oni Runins or Fire Main Cubs. He's just filling a slot that doesn't really need to be filled at the moment, but I can see potentially some benefit to this card with weapons on it. As it is, I don't really like picking this card in draft, and I don't really like playing it in ranked. Like, there's certain decks that might like him, but there's so many different red cards that love to have weapons on them. Young Gun is kind of not really fitting in that sort of slot. Like, you just don't really need this card for the slot that it's filling, and it's a little bit redundant as far as things go. I am curious to experiment with it more in ranked and in draft, but for the most part I'm not sure that he's super important, and he runs pretty low on my draft rankings. I think he's sort of a weak card. So, but interesting card, and kind of fun with a couple of things. Someone points out that he's, Murthem points out that it's good chakram bait, which is to say Steelfang Chakram. And that is something worth considering. Like, Vadius Clanfather generates Steelfang Chakrams, and if you're playing with a lot of, like, the new, like, smaller weapons, Young Gun has some potential there. I'm curious to see if there's ever going to be a Young Gun deck. I haven't found it yet, but I haven't really experimented too much with aggro because that's not my traditional sort of brew archetype interest. So, like, this might not be a card that I particularly try to break, or at least not until later in the season, or later in the, like, later in Omens, but, you know, it might have some potential. I'm certainly not sold on it yet, though. Okay, Blink Wolf, 2/1 Warp, 2-cost card. As a 2-cost card, I think this card is pretty reasonable. Like, runs alongside a lot of other 2-drops pretty well. So he's very good in draft, and I do think that, like, the ability to just get a 2/1 and draw a card is very, very powerful, even if it isn't something that you do reliably. Most of the time in draft, if you play Blink Wolf, you're going to be able to at least trade with another 2-drop, and then, like, Blink Wolf gets his value. So, like, even if you don't get to warp him, Blink Wolf feels pretty good in draft. He's a very worthy card in that respect. In ranked, I've had reasonable success with him. We're actually putting him in our Fire starter deck for Eternal Basics 1. I am considering switching him out for Ticking Grenadin, but I think he does a reasonable job there, so it's something sort of worth looking at and considering. Loudcat agrees. 1 second. Yeah, let's see here. So, like, yeah, as far as this card goes, the thing about it is that it is somewhat counterintuitive to Red's most common strategy, which is to be very, very aggressive. Being able to play a lot of units with without like sort of end is kind of useful for red. Red actually needs card advantage cards like this, and that means that Blinkwolf sort of helps enable an archetype that doesn't exist yet, which is more red control based maneuvers. Red has a lot of burn spells, it has a lot of ways that it can actually like get some like decent advantage in the form of Blinkwolf and Katana, and that Hidden Shiv is an option. So there's a couple more cards that actually give red some pseudo card draw. If you experiment with these cards in ranked, you might be able to find something that's a little bit slower in red, but actually is able to play out those cards and do some like cool stuff that way. And yeah, I think that's got some potential there. In general, like the card's really good in like a sort of average sense. A lot of decks are a lot more focused than that, which makes it a little bit difficult for ranked, but in draft this card is just solid, so well worth picking up as a common. Okay, Smith's Hammer. +2/+0 and Overwhelm. For me, this card has one purpose, and that is getting Geralt Iceheart to OTK someone with a Overwhelm Infiltrate where he gets a Decimate and just blows everything up. I've never been able to do it, so Smith's Hammer is kind of just a bummer for me. But yeah, this card has some potential. Like, being able to put Overwhelm on a unit is interesting. These small weapons seem to have a decent amount of support, and there's like kind of an interesting deck archetype that could like be formed there with Rakano Artisans and Oni Quartermasters and all of like the like little units that really like weapons. You could do some sort of cool weapon aggro. That's a little bit risky, and like most of the weapons that have previously been good are the weapons that actually have the ability to offset the weakness that you get from weapons, which is that when you play those weapons and your opponent kills your unit, you're often getting 2 for 1. Smith's Hammer doesn't fix that problem, and that makes it a pretty difficult card to play effectively. In draft, this certainly has some playability. It's not a super strong card. In ranked, I don't see this card being good, but I can maybe see it on like some lifesteal units or like a couple of things. Like if you're just going super aggressive, maybe Smith's Hammer makes the cut. But at that point, you're basically it's the same slot as Ornate Katana, and Katana tends to fill that slot pretty well. So it's pretty tough to say that Smith's Hammer is good, especially since the next card on our list, Granite Ring, does a lot of the job of Smith's Hammer a lot better, even though it's a much slower card. Alright. Okay, so Granite Ring. Once per turn, you may pay 3 to give your units +1 strength and Overwhelm this turn. All of the rings are very solid draft cards that actually have some potential in ranked. With I think one exception, Amethyst Ring is not terribly strong in ranked, but they're basically like super slow in ranked, and in draft they're really good value engines that can actually like create a really interesting situation. Of the 5 rings, I would say that Granite Ring is maybe the strongest of the batch. Not only is its +1 strength and Overwhelm like a pretty reasonable effect on any one unit, but the fact that it actually gives it to all of your units means that it's often like better than a Rally, which is a card that you often want to cast in red anyways. I think Granite Ring has a lot of potential. Being able to give your stuff Overwhelm tends to give it a lot of inevitability, and if you are building sort of a slower board, then the Granite Ring is going to push that slow board across your opponent's face in a way that is really devastating. Granite Ring again doesn't support the super aggressive strategy very well, but it means that red has a lot more options for slower decks, and as far as like Praxis tokens have been concerned, as well as Praxis midrange, I found this card to be very useful in ranked. In draft, this is like an auto pick for me. I think this card is really super good to have at least one of in red, and like if you have at least one of them, then you can do some really good stuff with it. It's just a really good place to sink your power. You get a very good bonus out of it, and the Overwhelm ability is like really relevant when it comes to all of your big stuff. This card is less useful in tokens than you would expect, just because tokens don't really need an extra 1 strength and Overwhelm is kind of meaningless to them, but it's still a mild rally effect, and it can make your tokens have a little bit more bite. Yeah, I think overall this card's, yeah, just A+ in draft, and then in ranked it's definitely got a couple of things that it fits into. Oftentimes Granite Ring will be a one-of in ranked, actually, is the other thing to sort of mention about it. Like, if you are playing it, then one of them is not a bad idea. And, like, it's just a reasonable idea in ranked to have one of them. Okay. And yes, it's another good card to push Iceheart through. Okay, so Grenade. Sacrifice a unit to deal 3 damage to an enemy unit and 3 damage to the enemy player. I like this card significantly better than Burnout, which is its counterpart. A lot of Omens cards have some redundancy with the sort of with the Empty Throne cards. And the idea behind that is that like you can still build particular archetypes of decks, including like the Sacrifice Outlet deck. Grenade is sort of the new Sacrifice Outlet cards. It fills that slot a lot better than Burnout does, just because it's a cheaper card, and it also has a couple of interesting strengths to it. First off, the fact that it deals 2 different instances of damage, which means that it is a card that interacts with spell damage cards, specifically Cloud Snake Harrier and Boltcrafter Shaman. So if you can get a little bit of extra spell damage, then Grenade is a card that really, really likes that. Maelstrom Bell also interacts with it pretty well. So yeah, there's some interesting interactions there, both in draft and in ranked, that you can pretty easily access. In terms of what it actually does to kill your opponent's stuff, I think it's fairly relevant. Like, being able to get rid of even a small unit with a token is pretty good, and then the extra 3 damage to the enemy player is actually very important for specific setups. This card also interacts, of course, with like your relic weapons and things like that. You can give it Overwhelm, you can give it like Lifesteal. There are some potential options in ranked to set up like some cool token strategies. I think Grenade is almost... Grenade's major weakness is that it is a slow spell, not a fast spell, which Burnout is a fast spell, and that makes it a little bit on the weak side. But there's still a lot of situations where you might want to throw a token away, and if you want to throw a 1-1 or a 0-1 away, Grenade is definitely going to get the job done. So with cards like Ephemeral Wisp, Granite and Drone, Assembly Line, maybe even Humbug Swarm, Grenade actually has some potential in those decks, and might see a little bit of play. That being said, it's kind of expensive. The stats on it aren't particularly great, so I'm not sure about the ranked potential of this card. And it's also a card that's really, really hard to sacrifice units to, because most of the time the units that you're going to want to sacrifice, you're going to want to do them as a fast spell effect. Like, basically this card is mostly value when you get a 1-1 or lower with it, and it's not very good for sacrificing like your 2-2s and your 3-3s, which are cards that you're going to have a lot more commonly. You kind of have to build around Grenade, which makes it a trickier pickup, but still pretty playable in draft. Hip Shot. Deal 2 damage with Warp. Card hasn't made amazing rounds in ranked, but it's got some potential there. It's certainly a good draft card, because you always need removal in draft, and removal that draws you cards is even better. Yeah, I would say that this card is very, very strong in draft. Interacts okay with spell damage. Can have some issues with like certain cards that want to like cost reduce it or increase its damage, but overall not terribly bad. I would say that being able to deal 2 damage to anything is just a reasonable effect. The card is a little bit on the expensive side, and it turns out that the ability to warp a trick off the top of your deck can be kind of interesting. Overall, I think it rates very average across both ranked and draft, but you do want removal in draft, so you should rate it a little bit higher there. Okay. Jawbone Hatchet. Spark +2/+2 for 3. Now this card really doesn't have a lot of play power in ranked, because ranked just has a lot of good red weapons that it's perfectly fine playing, including Sword of Icaria, Charchain Flail, and Magma Javelin. So, as a result, Jawbone Hatchet Spark is just a little bit on the weak side. In draft, this card is definitely reasonable. You don't even need this Spark to necessarily get some value out of it. Just killing a 1 health unit is kind of nice. But you're pretty likely to get the Spark, and if you do, you have a 3/3 weapon, which is fairly resilient to a couple of different things, and it can actually get you like 2-for-1 card advantage in some situations. There are a lot of ways to trigger the Spark on Jawbone Hatchet and get a decent benefit out of it, and I think that it's probably worth playing in that respect. Yeah, this card is not going to see any play in ranked, it's just not good enough, and the double red is another sort of nail in the coffin. Like, it's just a little bit too influence heavy. So, yeah, maybe in like a super, super aggressive tokens deck, but again, I think there's a lot of things that fit that slot in red, so it seems pretty unlikely. Sparkbot. A 1/4 with Spark, play a 1/1 Grenadin. This card costs 3, and in terms of draft, has been a very, very effective card. I would say that it's actually like a lot better than I expected it to be, and I kind of expected it to be okay. So, like, yeah, as a 1/4, it is not vulnerable to Torch, which is fairly important. And like, it is just pretty good at blocking most of the stuff that your opponent is going to be laying down in the first 3 to 4 turns. In addition, the 1/1 Grenadin tends to be a very good throwaway for cards like Grenade, Burnout, Combust, Devour. There are tons of good sacrifice outlets in red and purple, and you're probably going to pick some of them up if you're going to be playing Sparkbot at all. But in general, this card just provides enough stats and enough pressure to really make a difference on the board in draft. It's good at being defensive. It's kind of good at being aggressive. Just having 2 units that can attack at the same time can be very relevant. And yeah, I think he fills most of those slots very, very well. He's not particularly aggressive. He's not particularly great at defense, but he's very good for a red card. So, like, yeah, he kind of fills a lot of holes in red, and again, kind of makes it possible to enable a more slow red deck, which is something that red sorely needs. So, yeah, I like this card okay. Stonescar Excavator. Once per turn, you may pay 4 and discard a power card to deal 1 damage to the enemy player for each power card in your void. One of 2 cards that interact with power cards in your void in an Omens, which is kind of an interesting thing to note. So the cost on this card is very, very heavy. The damage on it is somewhat exponential, not quite, but close, and it is inevitable. So this card will just win the game on its own if you can use the rest of your cards to hold down the fort and afford to pay 4 every turn, which is a tall order, a very tall order. I would say in draft this card has a little bit of potential, but is often not a card that you want to be picking up, especially as a rare. But like, might be worth it. Could be that you have like some cool things that you can do with it. In ranked, this card has a very low amount of decks that it wants to interact with, but in the decks that it does want to interact with, it has fairly high potential. The decks in particular that I'm thinking of are Means to an End and Reanimator. Anything where you are trying to discard a bunch of your own cards, Stonescar Excavator can turn into a 25 damage bomb for 7. And there's a decent potential for that to happen. Like, it's more likely to deal like 18 to 20, but that's still pretty good in a red deck. And like, that's something that you could definitely do if you can just discard a bunch of your cards. This will get you like sort of a faster Means to an End trigger, kind of an interesting thing to play with. That being said, still pretty slow. I can kind of see it in a slow control deck with like Stonescar cards in general, but I'm not sure if that's going to be your total finisher. So yeah, I'm not sure that I'm convinced of this in draft or ranked, but there's a couple of interesting decks to try out with it. Fairly low quality ranked card, fairly low quality draft card, but interesting. Fun build around me. Alright. Yeah, Means to an End looks really interesting with that card. And of course you can give it lifesteal and like Overwhelm and all of the things that you can do with weapons. So relic weapons can do some cool things with that. Stone Shaker. This card's a fun one. 1/1, summon, reduce the cost of each unit in your deck by 1. That summon effect is super worth it. And being able to replay it consistently is actually really, really interesting. So if you can do like some very interesting shenanigans, then getting cheaper flyers and things can really sort of benefit your deck. You have to build Stone Shaker a little weirdly, like you have to build a lot of card advantage into your deck, but I think he's worth picking up in draft because cheaper units can be very much better, and I think that he's kind of interesting to build ranked decks around. There are a couple of things that I've seen that have been pretty good with Stone Shaker. A particularly cool one that I've seen has been like reducing the cost of 2-drops to 1-drops. And then when you do that, you can just like pick all of the 1-drops out of your deck with cards like Minotaur... Oh goodness, I don't remember. Press Gang. Minotaur Press Gang? Press Gang something or other? I'll remember the name of the card at some point. It's Press Gang... Press Gang something. Press Gang? Press? It's in green. Crown Watch Press Gang. That's what we got. Alright. So yeah, as far as Stone Shaker goes, like this card has a lot of potential in like sort of interesting red control decks. I think that red control is an archetype that people really haven't explored yet, and there's a really interesting deck there. So fiddle with this card. It's actually pretty good. It does, of course, have an element of trappiness to it, where, like, basically, like, if you are playing this card and you don't do enough to, like, sort of support the card advantage that it wants, to support the, like, expensive units that it wants to reduce, or to, like, just sort of play with that kind of setup, then Stone Shaker will bite you. So, in both draft and in ranked, you have to make sure that you have both kind of a high number of medium to high cost units and a decent amount of card draw. But if you have those 2 qualities, then Stone Shaker will probably improve the quality of your deck. So, interesting card. Twin Barrel. 0/0 double damage for 3. It's a weapon, so Yeah, spellless double damage at a decent cost. I think I like this card pretty well. It fills a similar vein to Righteous Fury as a fun trick, and as a fun trick that you can sort of play to deal a bunch of damage, it's really interesting. Righteous Fury is a relatively playable card. Twin Barrel is actually a similarly playable card, even though it doesn't gain you that life back. The ability to give double damage to something at 3 cost is actually fairly relevant on a bunch of different cards, and can often lead to a very quick victory. Overall, the card's pretty expensive and poorly statted, so it mostly functions as a trick in red decks that can really support it, and in draft and ranked, that's a tall order, so this card is like a solid C+ for me in both draft and ranked. But it's got some interesting things going on. I kind of support it. As far as like all of the throwaway weapons that you have in red are, like this one is probably the strongest of the new Omens weapons that are in mono red. It's fairly interesting. It's got a lot of potential play arounds. It's got a lot of interesting combos. It is often a bad card, but has some potential to be a good one. So yeah. Audacious Bandit, Spark Quick Draw 4/2. As a draft card, I found this card to be very effective. Being able to get the Spark on it means that you have a card that is just unblockable and also does a lot of damage. It has a low amount of health, so it is a fair card, and I don't necessarily think that fair cards are the thing that you want the most of in draft, but like it is a card that if you get the Spark on it, you can often just win a game in draft with. In ranked, this card does not have any sort of play value. It's just a little too expensive, it doesn't provide enough stats, and the quick draw is fairly irrelevant on a 4-drop at that stage in the game, so not going to do a lot for your board state in ranked. Pretty likely to get killed immediately. In draft, where removal is much less relevant, this is a pretty decent card. Same goes for Cannoneer. Card has quite a bit of value in draft. Getting the Spark is very useful. The Firebomb is actually pretty useful in draft because your opponent has a smaller deck size. It's not typically going to trigger, but when it does, it's going to be devastating, and a 5/1 for 4 is still pretty reasonable. But again, that health value means that it's pretty likely to get killed by just about anything, and it doesn't do enough in terms of ranked. So this card just doesn't play in ranked. Interesting draft card, though. Groundbreaker. 3/6, the enemy player can't gain health, Spark, double damage. This card is hard to play, but it is pretty good in the decks that want to play it. So mono red is the most common thing that you're going to see it in. You can actually see it in some Rakano, some Stone Scar, some other options that actually don't mind having the Groundbreaker. And as far as its job goes, it does it pretty well. Being able to stop the opponent from gaining life is very useful. It means that you have a very good safety valve for the Life Force decks, which ended up not being too out of control, but it's still kind of nice to actually have that there. And then the actual like double damage ability, combined with the fact that this card is not vulnerable to Vanquish, means that it's a really interesting type of Titan that can sort of exchange with Sandstorm Titan and be pretty relevant on board. Overall, this card will not has not been like breaking an exceptional amount of ground on ranked ladder, but there's a meta for it, and it is a card that definitely plays in a lot of different interesting decks. And I'd say it's a very strong draft card, of course. In ranked, it's also pretty good. Like, I would say this card is, yeah, on the strong side to be certain. The triple red is a pretty significant influence cost, and that's probably the thing that's keeping it back from being an absolutely insane card. But it's definitely on the strong side, and playing it on 4 will often be the end of your opponent. So, interesting card to be certain. The weaknesses of it are that it can still die to things like Suffocate. It is a thing that can die to a lot of different spells, and when it dies, your opponent can gain health again. And oftentimes it doesn't really get through for that double damage effect because you don't have too many ways to give it Overwhelm. But yeah, playable, pretty significant, can certainly have some good interactions with a lot of other Omens cards. I'd expect to see more of this card. I think it's going to be a pretty common card in Omens in general, and I think it's, yeah, interesting. All right. Yeah, you just have to hit the opponent for Spark. So if you don't know what Spark is basically if you hit your opponent, then when your opponent has taken damage this turn, it does something extra. All right. So the last thing, Library Phoenix. We just got beat by this card in draft, and that's actually to be expected. This card has some strength in draft just because it is a 5/2 flyer for 4. A 5/2 flyer for 4 is a relevant body in draft. The reduction of cost is not something you will get often in ranked. I don't think this card has a lot of ranked potential. It is not the same as an end of turn effect that reduces the cost of cards in your hand by 1, and the non-unit things is actually pretty relevant as well. So, like, Library Phoenix is a card that you play it down, and it is kind of an aggressive flyer, and then the cost reduction is something that you can't rely on, so you can't really build your deck around it. But if you're playing like a super aggressive deck anyways, then Library Phoenix becomes better. There's a lot of caveats, a lot of ifs, ands, or buts. You could build a deck that makes Library Phoenix work. It's probably not going to be as good as most of the things that you want to make Library Phoenix work. In draft, this card basically is a big evasive flyer when you can get yourself hellbound, or hellbent, which is to say when you have no cards in your hand. So a big evasive flyer when you have no cards in your hand is really interesting. That is something that you can build around in draft. I'm not going to say that the card is going to be super strong there, but a 5/2 flyer can be pretty okay there. So if you can get the right type of draft deck going, Library Phoenix likes it. And with ranked, there's one deck that likes it, and maybe it doesn't. So tricky card, not sure if it's a good one. Outlands Brute. 4/1 charge warp. When an enemy spell is played directly on Outlands Brute, he deals 2 damage to the enemy player. Card's still pretty good at being aggressive. Does provide some amount of card advantage. The warp ability is kind of relevant in that respect. I think this card doesn't do enough. Like, most of the time the dealing 2 damage to the enemy player actually doesn't feel very relevant, and your opponent may find some way around it, or may just take the damage. Like, that feels pretty okay. If you pay 4 and they kill your thing and they take 2 damage, they don't usually feel too out of it. Outlands Brute can do enough, and it's certainly good in draft for being very, very aggressive, but it is a card that is difficult to use offensively. Defensively, this card has a little bit more potential. Warp decks, as I said, have like some interesting control archetypes, and having a 4 attack unit means that you can actually stymie quite a few different interesting options, since your opponent has to actually take some damage to block it. Outlands Brute has some interesting back and forth to it. I would expect that there might be some ranked decks that can run it, but at the moment, it's mostly just a really decent draft red card if you're going to be kind of aggressive. And even then, it's kind of like a C. It's okay. Reforge. Draw a weapon from your void. It gets +2/+2. I've been very impressed with this card. In draft and in ranked, I think it's a really reasonable effect. Getting a bigger weapon is usually just a really good thing. And the bigger weapon, if the bigger weapon is a relic weapon, then it's a really, really important thing that often provides you with more card advantage than you would expect. Being able to make a relic weapon bigger means that you get more life out of that weapon. You often get more exchanges of damage, so you just get more units out of your opponent's hand. This card can interact with a lot of really, really important armory cards, and with Smuggler's Stash being nerfed, I expect to see a lot more of it. Yeah, the +2/+2 is a very relevant amount of effect. The drawing a weapon back from your void is not as important, but like, yeah, it's important to actually get that weapon, so fairly interesting card to be picking up. Yeah, I like this card in draft pretty well. I would definitely pick it fairly highly in draft, especially if you can get the weapons for it. And in ranked, well, I mean, you have to get the weapons for it. In ranked, this card is potentially an armory staple, and at the very least, a good armory side. So, yeah, interesting card. Gonna see some play. Swift Stranger. 3/3 strangers have charge. One of the more interesting strangers provides a pretty good benefit because strangers are actually very, very likely to be attacking in almost every turn. Most of the time they're pretty suicidal. There are a lot of things that sort of force them to be offensive and can get them a lot of damage as a result. The card's pretty expensive though, and giving strangers charge is not necessarily the thing that fixes strangers forever. Like, we've been talking about how strangers might get better in Omens, and they have gotten better in Omens, so I think there might be a stranger deck here. They haven't gotten so good that I'm convinced that this is a good ranked card. All the same, a 3/3 charge in draft is reasonable, certainly not a body you can ignore, and might be okay. So, a little bit of damage out of it, decent amount of value, not gonna like completely win a game, but has some potential to at least influence your board state positively, so maybe worth picking up in draft. Thunderhoof Warrior. Overwhelm, ultimate, pay 6 to give +2/+2. This card can't be played in Ranked, but is very good in Draft. As a 3/3 for 4, that's a reasonable stat line. The Overwhelm effect is much more important in Draft, and being able to make this into a 5/5 Overwhelm puts it on a level with a lot of other really, really good Overwhelm cards that are fairly obnoxious to deal with. Card interacts okay with some Warcry effects and some of the things that you actually really want to be doing in red, including putting weapons on it. Yeah, I'd say as far as draft cards go, this is one of the better 4-drops to be picking up. So, interesting. Not going to see play in Ranked, it's just a little too weak. Dustblind. Warp exhaust 2 enemy units. Probably the worst warp card, but playable in draft. In Ranked, I don't think it's ever going to be playable. Bad News is 1 cost over this and does a lot more. The ability to exhaust 2 enemy units is pretty reasonable, but you might as well just Cloud of Ash at that point, since you want to have control over that effect. Yeah, this card kind of is a replacement for Cloud of Ash in Omens, but it's not really doing its job correctly, so I would say that this is kind of a pass. But yeah, if you need a way to get damage across in draft, this is a potential finisher when you haven't picked one up. Okay. Gun Down. Deal 5 damage to a unit without quick draw. Let's get some water in us first because my throat is breaking down for some reason. Okay. So this is a draft kill spell, which means that it's something you should rate very highly in draft, but in Ranked it's not going to do a lot for you. The dealing 5 damage to a unit is going to kill most units that you want to kill, including Towering Terrazon, which is one of the big terrors of the whole setup. It doesn't kill 6 health units, and it doesn't kill units with quick draw, which is relevant more often than you would expect in draft. But I would still pick this card over basically any unit, because basically removal is really important in draft, and even if it's expensive removal, it's worth playing here. Gun Down is not terribly tempo efficient, has some weaknesses, can be a little bit on the off side. I just don't see it being played in a ranked deck, but it's not too awful. And yeah, in terms of draft, this is a card that you do want to pick fairly highly. Pit Fighter, 6/3 for 5. Well worth ignoring in ranked, and pretty well worth ignoring in draft. Certainly pick it up if you need to fill the 5 slot, but beyond that, it's not really worth it. Pouncing Drake. Flying Warp 4/4. 4/5. One of the better warp cards, and actually a card that I think plays pretty well in ranked. In draft, this card is pretty bananas. It can be it's already a reasonable unit. A 3/3 for 5 is a playable draft card. A 4/4 for 5 with flying is an extremely playable draft card. So yeah, I would say that this card is really, really good in draft. Certainly just an absolute bomb. In ranked, this card is another one of those cards that enables red control. It is card draw plus a really relevant unit that actually provides inevitability and is capable of being defensive. This card does mostly everything and provides, again, a much more sort of balanced type of red deck. So, interesting card to experiment with. One of the better warp cards, and on the strong side, I would say. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing a few more of these cards in ranked decks. Stonepetter Heretic. When this card attacks, double its attack this turn. Real fun card in draft. Pretty good for the 5 slot. A bit more interesting than Pit Fighter because it's got that extra health and can really interact well with a lot of different damage spells. The thing I like about Stonepetter Heretic is the thing I like about Sensari Brigand, which is that Stonepetter Heretic interacts with double damage in a way that doubles your double damage. And that means that you can really kind of stack up some interesting effects and create some cool combos. That would be the one reason why I might play Stonepetter Heretic in a ranked deck. But more likely, you're probably not going to be putting a Twin Barrel on this guy or putting Righteous Fury on this guy. You're just going to be attacking with him every turn, at which point he's a 4/4 for 5, which is not an awful stat line. And he benefits really well from all sorts of buffs, which means that he's pretty potentially good. Yeah, I would say that this card is reasonably playable in draft, and you're not going to play him in ranked very much, but if you do, it's just in a deck where you want to do double damage all the time. There is... yeah. He has silly interactions with a lot of things, including Bad News, which is the next card we're going to talk about. Okay, bad news. Warp ready your unit, they can attack again. I've talked about this card before. It is Coup De Gras, or like there was a 5-cost card called Coup De Gras that had this ability. And it wasn't the most amazing card in Ranked, but it was still pretty fun to play with. I'd say bad news, of course, you know, you're not going to get it in Draft. It probably has some potential there. In Ranked, it's a really interesting finisher. One of the things that's kind of interesting about it is that it isn't always a finisher. So, like, if you're playing, like, these sort of, like, weird reliable decks where you're, like, playing, like, sort of both an even amount of offense and defense, Pouncing Drake, Navani Warsinger, anything that actually, like, allows you to attack and survive, Bad News has some potential there to actually get the warp card advantage and be kind of a beneficial card. As it stands, like, I'm not sure if Bad News is going to be the perfect thing to play in most situations, but there are a couple of decks that kind of like it. It's got a cool ranked infinite combo where you can play Westwind Herald and then Bad News, and that's the entirety of the combo. Like, that's it right there. You just Westwind... Oh, you do need a Cabal Spymaster to give yourself infinite infiltrate. But, like, yeah, like as a 3-color infinite damage combo, that's kind of cool. It's got a couple of, like, potential finishing blow deals in sort of big Praxis decks. I think this card is kind of an interesting 1 or 2 of in those types of decks. Typically, you're not going to run 4 copies of it in anything, but something worth considering. Has some potential to be a really interesting card, especially now that Flame Blast is no longer the most reliable way to finish a game. So, yeah, on the interesting side. Okay, Cannon Bearer, 5/6 summon, deal 1 damage to the enemy. As a ranked card, this card does not do enough. Like, the 1 damage is kind of nice, the warp is kind of nice, the 5/6 body is just not good enough for 6. Like, I think this card is pretty unlikely to see play in Ranked, but if you need to fill your deck with warp cards, maybe. In Draft, this card is just super reliable. A 5/6 body is really good, the deal 1 damage to an enemy is almost always relevant, and the warp is, of course, also relevant. Being able to just play more threats than your opponent will win you a lot of games. I find Cannon Bearer really interesting because Cannon Bearer is a card that really complains about the size of their guns and also has enormous guns and does no damage with those guns. So that's my comment on Cannon Bearer. It's a pretty good draft card. You should definitely be picking it up. It is something that fills that slot very well. And 6, 7, and 8 cost draft cards are a lot more playable than they used to be. So well worth it considering, and I would say this card is very good in draft. Flame Stoker. Cool legendaries that play in furnaces. Man, people didn't like this card when it was announced, I think, and they were wrong about it. And I think it's actually proven out to be a very good card in quite a few decks. Big Praxis included, Overwhelm Rod. Yeah, this card plays pretty well in a lot of different things. It is just a really good thing to be putting down on 6 in any sort of slow control deck, any sort of aggressive sort of mid-range deck. If you can defend your face long enough for Flamestoker to come online, Flamestoker is going to provide so much value for you over the course of a game that it's pretty likely to be very, very relevant. Like this is usually a card that wins you the game when it's played. It might not win you the game the turn that it's played, but it will give you that inevitability and give you the ability to sort of push through your opponent's stuff, especially with other types of burn cards at your command, like Torch, Piercing Shot, Obliterate. There's just so many good burn cards that really like having a 5/5 unit attacking in every turn. I think Flamestoker's super good. Yeah, this card interacts super well with Dawnwalker and with the Overwhelm card Shepherd's Horn that really likes gaining life off of every Overwhelm unit that you play. This is one of the stronger legendaries in red, and probably the strongest red... This might be the strongest Omens red legendary. Like, it's certain... Yeah, I mean, we're only in mono red right now, so this is definitely the strongest Omens mono red legendary. But yeah, it does a lot of work, and it does it very well. So yeah, its competition is Sindok Rage Incarnate, and Sindok's really good too, but Flamestoker has seen a lot of play in quite a few different ranked decks. This is a really solid card, and in draft it's just disgusting if you get one. Like, getting an Infernus every turn is really, really relevant. It's not without its weaknesses, but it is something that is well worth playing on 6 if you've got the power for it, and will get you a lot of benefit. This card plays in a lot of different decks. Really, really strong. Okay, Burning Glaive, 5/3 for 7. That amount of health and damage is completely irrelevant in ranked, and suffers from the problem of is not Deep Forge Plate. But in draft, this card is actually very strong. Being able to play a big weapon is just a big deal. Burning Glaive is a really good finisher on any sort of flyer, any sort of unblockable unit, anything with quick draw, anything that has an ability where it gets lifesteal or quick draw or something. Yeah, there's just so many cards that like having a Burning Glaive on them and just win the game for you when they have a Burning Glaive on them. Stone Pen or Heretic, anything with Overwhelm, it's just a huge pile of red cards. You play it for 7 and you win the game. Like, Burning Glaive is actually very, very solid in draft. Worth picking up, pay attention to it in draft, and consider it as your finisher if you can't find a better finisher. There aren't that many good finishers overall, so, like, yeah, this one's really on the strong side. So, interesting draft card, can't be played in ranked. Sindok Rage Incarnate. Flying, Sindok costs 1 less for each damage the enemy player has taken this turn. This is, of course, a draft bomb. Let's not even talk about that. But, yeah, like, the ability to deal damage to the opponent and then deal more damage is something of a win more ability, but Sindok is a card that builds your board after a suicidal charge, and that's actually really relevant. Yeah, this card has a lot of different play patterns that are pretty relevant. Being able to play it after like an Obliterate and a Torch to face is certainly fine. Being able to play it after like a Soulfire Drake attacks or like anything where you can get damage through and get Sindok out, Sindok is going to be a pretty relevant body. The 4 health means that he is kind of hard to kill. The 9 power means that he's on the interesting side for like the overall like cost reduction stuff. The thing I really like about Sindok is that you can play him for cheap and then unstable form him into a Scourge of Frostdome, which, yeah, that's a lot of fun and well worth doing. Can he become a World Joiner now? Is that the other thing he can do? I'm not 100% certain. But yeah, Sindok's interesting. Not going to fit in every ranked deck, but certainly benefits a lot of this more aggressive red and green decks. I think Sindok's definitely got a lot of play to him, and we'll see play in quite a few different sort of crazy aggressive decks that really want to be doing cool things with him. So yeah, interesting card, well worth playing. And that's actually it for the red cards. Yeah, it's a fun set. The red deck, just the sole monocolored cards mostly fit in draft, but there are a couple of really solid standout ranked cards as well. Pummel is a very good one. We see Hidden Shiv has some potential. Like, there's just a couple of like interesting choices. Stone Shaker's interesting, Twin Barrel's interesting, Stone Scar Excavator's interesting. I think there's a lot of cool things that we can build decks out of in this particular set, and it's going to be interesting to see where all of that goes. Overall, this is made for a fun set to draft, and red decks didn't get a lot of extra power out of just their mono red cards, but they see a little bit of decent stuff, and they have got some really good hybrid cards coming up, which we will discuss, I think, in particular when we review Praxis cards. So that's it for me, for the YouTube folks. Thank you for watching. Feel free to like or subscribe. For the Twitch folks, we're going to play a couple more games. See you next time.